There is a special kind of pain that doesn't come from strangers, but from your own child. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my daughter's life. And for a while, it truly was. The ballroom glowed under crystal chandeliers, white roses lined every table, and soft music floated through the air like a promise. 200 guests filled the room, dressed in tailored suits and elegant gowns, glasses clinking as they celebrated love, youth, and new beginnings. My daughter, Rebecca, looked breathtaking in her wedding dress. Watching her walk down the aisle earlier that day had nearly broken me, in the best way. I cried like any proud mother would. I believed, foolishly, that nothing could ruin that feeling. I was wrong. When Rebecca stood up during the reception and took the microphone, I expected a polite thank you speech. Maybe a sentimental story about childhood, maybe a few tears. Instead, she smiled and aimed straight at me. "I want to talk about my mom for a moment," she said, tilting her head playfully. The crowd chuckled, relaxed, unaware. "She's been going through what I guess you'd call a late-life reinvention." Laughter rippled across the room. At 61, she suddenly decided she wants to build an empire. She actually used air quotes. The laughter grew louder. I sat frozen in my chair, my smile stiff, my hands clenched beneath the tablecloth. My heart began to pound, not from nerves, but from something far worse. Humiliation. "We keep telling her she should relax and enjoy life," Rebecca continued, amused. "But she won't listen. She insists she's competing in business with people half her age." More laughter. I scanned the room and saw faces twisted in amusement, friends, relatives, co-workers of my new son-in-law. People I'd never met, all suddenly bonded by one shared joke. Me? I wanted to disappear. But the most painful part wasn't the laughter. It was realizing my daughter was enjoying it. I had spent 30 years raising her. 30 years working quietly, supporting her dreams, sacrificing my own. And now, on one of the most important days of her life, I had become her punchline. What none of them knew, what she didn't know, was that while they laughed at the delusional older woman, the most powerful person in that room sat silently at table 6. Because just a few seats away sat a man, who would soon stand up, pale and shaken, and say 5 words that would stop the celebration cold. But to understand how her wedding became the most validating moment of my life, you need to know what happened 2 years earlier. Back then, I was recently divorced, unemployed, and invisible. After 3 decades as an operations manager, my company restructured, a polite way of saying I was replaced with someone younger and cheaper. My marriage ended shortly after. My ex-husband found a new wife 20 years younger. Apparently, that was considered normal. I was 60, alone, and expected to quietly fade. That's when I made a decision. I could accept that my best years were behind me. Or I could prove they weren't. I chose the second option. I started small, consulting, efficiency systems, acquisitions. Nothing flashy. No social media. No bragging. Just results. And results came fast. But I kept it private. Especially from my family. Because every time I mentioned work, I saw the eye rolls. The polite smiles. The unspoken embarrassment. "Please don't talk about your business at the wedding," Rebecca had said weeks earlier. "Jake's colleagues are serious professionals." I promised I wouldn't. And I kept that promise. Even as they laughed. Even as my own daughter mocked me in front of 200 people. What Rebecca didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that her new husband worked for a company I already owned. And his boss was about to realize exactly who I was. But while they laughed at that embarrassing mom, one man in the room had just realized who I really was, and what he was about to do would stop the wedding cold. 2 years before the wedding, my life looked nothing like the woman they laughed at that night. Back then, I was just another, older employee, quietly escorted out of a company I had given my best decades to. 30 years of loyalty, efficiency, and problem-solving were reduced to a brief meeting, a folder of paperwork, and a rehearsed apology about restructuring. I remember walking to my car afterward, holding a cardboard box filled with desk photos and forgotten awards, wondering how someone could erase a lifetime of contribution in 15 minutes. That was the first lesson. The second came later that year, when my marriage officially ended. My husband moved on quickly. Younger woman. New house. Fresh start. People congratulated him like he had upgraded his life instead of abandoned it. Meanwhile, I downsized into a modest apartment and learned how loud silence can be when you're no longer needed. Rachel tried to be kind at first. But kindness has a way of turning into impatience when people believe you've reached your expiration date. "Mom, you should just rest for a while," she'd say. "Enjoy life. Maybe volunteer or travel." What she really meant was, stop trying. But something inside me refused to shut down. I had spent decades watching businesses succeed and fail from the inside. I knew inefficiencies before they became disasters. I knew how leadership decisions quietly destroyed companies long before balance sheets revealed the truth. That knowledge didn't disappear just because I turned 60. So I started consulting. At first, it was basic, workflow restructuring, cost analysis, operational cleanups. Small contracts. Quiet meetings. No fancy titles. No public announcements. I named the firm DT Enterprises, intentionally bland. Intentionally forgettable. I didn't want attention. I wanted leverage. Within months, something interesting happened. Clients didn't just want advice. They wanted partnership. They wanted capital. They wanted someone who understood risk without arrogance. Someone who listened before speaking. That's when acquisitions began. One struggling tech firm. Then another. Then one more. Each time, I stayed invisible. I didn't update LinkedIn. I didn't tell my family. I didn't correct their assumptions. Because every time I hinted at success, I was met with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. "That's cute, Mom. Good for you, staying busy. Just don't get your hopes up." So I stopped sharing. What Rachel didn't know was that while she worried about seating charts and flower arrangements, I was closing deals in boardrooms. While she planned her honeymoon, I was reviewing performance metrics across multiple companies. By the time her engagement was announced, I no longer worked with companies. I owned them. And still, I kept my lifestyle small. Old car. Modest apartment. Simple clothes. Not because I couldn't afford more, but because I didn't need external proof of my worth anymore. The irony was painful. The more successful I became, the smaller I appeared to the people closest to me. Rachel assumed the money I contributed to the wedding came from my divorce settlement. She never asked. I never corrected her. When she told me, "Please don't embarrass me by talking about your business," I agreed. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted her day to be about her. I didn't realize that my silence would be used as permission. Permission to mock. Permission to belittle. Permission to laugh. And now, sitting at table 6 during her reception, I finally understood something painful. My family wasn't just underestimating me. They were comfortable doing it. Because they believed I posed no threat to the story they had written for my life. What they didn't know, what none of them could imagine, was that several people laughing that night unknowingly worked for me. And one man in particular was about to connect the dots. He had been watching me quietly, listening carefully. And when he stood up, the room would never be the same again. What none of them knew was that while they dismissed my ambition, several people laughing that night unknowingly worked for me, and one of them was already putting the pieces together. After the speeches ended, the room slowly returned to its shallow buzz of conversation. Laughter resurfaced. Music resumed. Glasses clinked again, as if nothing cruel had just happened. But something had changed. I felt it before I saw it. Across the room, a man stood very still near the bar, tall, silver-haired, sharply dressed, holding a champagne flute he hadn't touched in minutes. His smile had disappeared completely. Instead, he was staring at me with an intensity that didn't match the rest of the celebration. That man was Michael Harrington. At the time, I knew him well. But he had no idea who I was yet. Michael was the chief operations executive of one of my largest acquisitions, a company Rachel's new husband worked for. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't enjoying the jokes. He was thinking. I watched him excuse himself from a conversation and slowly make his way toward my table. Every step he took seemed deliberate, like a man approaching a realization he couldn't unsee. "Miss Thompson?" he asked politely. "Yes," I replied, already knowing where this was heading. "I don't believe we've met properly," he said. "Michael Harrington." I accepted his handshake. Firm. Professional. The grip of someone used to negotiating power, not pretending it. "I work with your son-in-law," he added. I couldn't help overhearing the speeches. I gave a small, careful smile. "Yes. Quite entertaining." His jaw tightened. "May I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Of course." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "What kind of consulting do you actually do?" There it was. The question no one else had bothered to ask. "I focus on operational restructuring and strategic acquisitions," I said calmly. He blinked. "Acquisitions," he repeated. "Yes." A long pause followed. His eyes searched my face, not dismissively, but analytically. As if he were cross-referencing a memory. "DT Enterprises," he said slowly. "That's your firm, isn't it?" I nodded. The color drained from his face. "Oh," he whispered. That single word carried everything: shock, recognition, and sudden regret. "Miss Thompson," he said again, this time with an edge of disbelief, "you're that Thompson." I didn't correct him. He stepped back slightly, running a hand over his mouth. "Sterling Dynamics. Quantum Systems. Data Flow Solutions." He stopped listing names and looked directly at me. "You acquired all of them?" "Yes." For a moment, he looked genuinely unsteady, as if the floor had shifted beneath him. "Do you realize," he said carefully, "that half the people laughing tonight work for companies you own?" I did realize. But hearing it said out loud was different. "I prefer to keep a low profile," I replied. Michael shook his head slowly, his expression hardening, not toward me, but toward the room. "They mocked you," he said. "Your own daughter mocked you." I didn't answer. "That speech," he continued, anger now slipping through his professional calm, "was beyond inappropriate." "This is her wedding," I said quietly. I didn't want to cause a scene. He stared at me like I had just confessed to something unthinkable. You absorbed public humiliation, he said, to protect today. Before I could respond, another voice joined us. Everything okay here? Jake? My new son-in-law approached with an easy smile, completely unaware that the ground beneath his life was already cracking. Yes, Michael said slowly, turning to him. I was just learning more about your mother-in-law's business. Jake laughed. Oh, that? Yeah, Mom's little consulting thing. Keeps her busy. Michael's face changed instantly. Jake, he said carefully, do you have any idea who you're talking about? Jake shrugged. I mean, no offense, but she helps small companies, right? I watched Michael's patience snap, not loudly, but decisively. No, he said. She doesn't help small companies. He turned to me once more, as if seeking permission. I hesitated. Then nodded. And that nod changed everything. Michael straightened, his voice lowering but firm. Jake, he said, your mother-in-law isn't playing business. She is business. Jake frowned. What does that mean? Michael inhaled slowly. It means, he said, you work for a company she owns. Jake laughed once. Then stopped. Because Michael wasn't smiling. And suddenly, people nearby began to notice the tension. The silence started spreading. And I realized, with a mix of dread and inevitability, that this secret wasn't going to stay buried much longer. And when that man finally spoke to my son-in-law, the truth slipped out in one sentence, changing the power dynamic of the entire room forever. Jake's smile faded so quickly it was almost painful to watch. He looked from Michael to me, then back again, waiting for someone, anyone, to laugh and admit this was a misunderstanding. No one did. You're joking, Jake said finally, forcing a chuckle that landed flat. Right? Michael didn't blink. I'm not, he replied calmly. DT Enterprises acquired Sterling Dynamics 3 months ago. Jake shook his head. No? That's not possible. I would know. Michael's voice remained steady. You weren't informed because acquisitions at that level are handled above departmental leadership. The board answers to her. Jake turned to me, confusion melting into disbelief. Diana, he said slowly. I exhaled. Yes, I said. It's true. The silence between us felt heavy, thick enough to choke on. Jake opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes drifted past me, scanning the room, as if searching for confirmation, or denial from someone else. Unfortunately for him, confirmation was everywhere. Michael leaned in slightly. You might want to sit down. That's when Rachel noticed. She had been laughing with friends near the dance floor, glass of champagne in hand, when she saw Jake's posture stiffen. Her smile faltered. She followed his gaze, straight to us. And then she saw Michael. Her husband's boss. Standing rigid. Serious. Talking to me. Rachel frowned and began walking toward us. What's going on? She asked lightly, but her voice betrayed unease. Michael turned to her. Rachel, I owe your mother an apology. She blinked. For what? For the way she's been treated tonight, he said. Rachel laughed nervously. Oh, those speeches. It was all just jokes. Michael's jaw tightened. They weren't jokes, he said. They were dismissive. And inaccurate. Rachel looked confused now. I don't understand. Michael glanced at me again. I hesitated. But the room was already shifting. Conversations were slowing. People were watching. There was no going back. Rachel, I said softly, you asked me not to talk about my work tonight. I honored that. Yes, she replied. And thank you for that. But, I continued, you made assumptions about what I do. Her brow creased. Mom, you told me you were consulting. I am. She smiled faintly, relieved. Then what's the problem? Michael answered before I could. The problem, he said clearly, is that your mother is the CEO of DT Enterprises. Rachel froze. That's a consulting firm, she said uncertainly. Michael nodded. An acquisitions firm. Her eyes widened. Acquisitions? Yes, he said. 6 companies in 18 months. The glass slipped slightly in her hand. No, she whispered. That's not funny. I'm not joking, Michael said. Rachel looked at me now, not amused, not embarrassed, but frightened. Mom, she asked. I nodded once. Her face drained of color. You own Sterling? She asked. Yes. The company Jake works for, she pressed. Yes. Jake swallowed hard. Rachel's voice cracked. You never told me. I held her gaze. You never asked. That's when a sharp voice cut through the tension. Michael. The music had stopped. Mr. Harrington, another executive, stood nearby, curious eyes narrowing. More guests turned. Chairs shifted. Whispers spread like sparks. Michael straightened. I think, he said loudly enough for nearby tables to hear, there's been a misunderstanding tonight. A significant one. Rachel grabbed my arm. Mom, please, this isn't the time. I agree, I said gently. But it may already be too late. Michael inhaled deeply. You see, he said, raising his voice slightly, many of you know Diana Thompson as the bride's mother. Murmurs rippled. What you may not know, he continued, is that she's also the founder and controlling partner of DT Enterprises. Gasps. Forks paused mid-air. I felt every eye snap toward me. DT Enterprises, Michael said, owns Sterling Dynamics, Quantum Systems, and Data Flow Solutions. The whispers turned frantic. Rachel let go of my arm. Jake looked like he was about to be sick. And, Michael finished, a surprising number of people in this room report, directly or indirectly, to her. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was stunned. Rachel's voice was barely audible. Mom, is this true? I took a breath. And nodded. Within seconds, whispers turned into panic, smiles disappeared, and the celebration froze, because the truth could no longer be contained. Michael turned toward the stage and gestured toward the microphone. For a moment, no one moved. 200 people sat frozen in place, unsure whether this was still a wedding reception or something else entirely. The air felt tight, electric, like a storm holding its breath. I think, Michael said carefully, Miss Thompson should be the one to clarify. He offered me the microphone. Every instinct in me screamed no. I hadn't come here to be seen. I hadn't come to prove anything. I had come to watch my daughter get married and quietly disappear into the background. But silence had already cost me enough. I stood. The sound of my chair scraping against the floor echoed far louder than it should have. I walked slowly toward the microphone, aware of every stare, every whisper, every half-remembered joke someone had made about my late life phase. I took the microphone from Michael and paused. The room went completely still. Yes, I said softly. It's true. That was all it took. Gasps spread like a wave. I am the founder of DT Enterprises, I continued. And I do oversee several companies, some of which employ people sitting in this room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I never hid this out of shame, I said. I kept quiet out of respect. My eyes found Rachel. You asked me not to talk about my work tonight, because you believed it would embarrass you, I said gently. So I didn't. Rachel's lips trembled. But, I continued, when you joked about my dreams having expiration dates, when you called my work a crisis, you weren't mocking ambition. I paused. You were mocking accomplishments that already existed. The silence was suffocating. I didn't correct anyone, I said, because this was your wedding. I didn't want to turn your celebration into my announcement. I glanced around the room. But I will say this. I straightened my shoulders. There is nothing embarrassing about refusing to disappear. A murmur swept through the guests. There is nothing foolish about starting again, I added. And there is nothing cute about a woman who knows her worth and acts on it. I turned back to Rachel. You believed I was pretending, I said calmly. But the only pretending happening tonight was mine, pretending your words didn't hurt. Her face crumpled. I sat through those speeches, I continued, not because I agreed with them, but because I loved you more than my pride. Tears streamed down Rachel's face now. Jake finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Diana. I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I looked at him. You assumed, I said evenly, that a woman my age couldn't possibly know more than you. I let that sink in. That assumption deserves reflection. Michael stepped forward again. If I may add something, he said, addressing the room. I nodded. Ms. Thompson, he said, has endured this entire evening with dignity. Many people here, executives included, spoke to her condescendingly without knowing who she was. Several heads dropped. What impresses me most, Michael continued, is that she allowed herself to be underestimated rather than disrupt her daughter's wedding. He turned to Rachel. That is restraint. And it is rare. Rachel was openly crying now. I placed the microphone back on its stand. That's all I wanted to say, I said quietly. Let's return the night to where it belongs, celebrating this marriage. I stepped back. The room slowly came back to life, but it was different now. People approached me with apologies instead of jokes. Handshakes replaced patronizing smiles. Conversations shifted from amusement to awe. But the hardest conversation was still ahead. Rachel followed me outside onto the terrace, her dress brushing the stone floor. Mom, she said, voice shaking, why didn't you tell me? I looked at her for a long moment. Because every time I tried, I said, you told me to act my age. She covered her mouth. I was horrible, she whispered. Yes, I replied gently. You were. The truth hung between us, raw and undeniable. And I knew, this revelation wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. With 200 people watching, I was handed the microphone, and I had to choose between staying silent, or saying the words that would change my relationship with my daughter forever. The celebration ended quietly after that. Not because people stopped dancing or the music shut off, but because something unspoken had settled over the room. Conversations were softer. Laughter sounded forced. People who had mocked me earlier now avoided my eyes or approached with stiff apologies. I accepted them politely. But my focus wasn't on them. It was on my daughter. Rachel barely spoke for the rest of the night. She smiled when people looked at her, nodded when necessary, but her eyes stayed distant. The confidence she had carried all evening, so effortless during the speeches, was gone. When she hugged me goodbye, her arms lingered longer than usual. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," I said. But love doesn't erase damage. The next morning, the newlyweds left for their honeymoon. There was no dramatic goodbye. No confrontation. Just silence layered over exhaustion. And silence, I've learned, can be louder than shouting. A week passed. Then 2. Rachel didn't call. Neither did Jake. When she finally reached out, it wasn't to apologize, it was to understand. "Can we talk?" she asked. We met at a quiet cafe, the kind with soft music and no interruptions. She looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence she'd worn so comfortably before. "I didn't know," she said immediately. "I swear I didn't." "I believe you," I replied. She frowned. "Then why didn't you correct me? Even once?" I stirred my tea slowly. "Because correcting you wouldn't have changed what you believed," I said. "You weren't confused. You were convinced." She flinched. "I thought I was protecting you," she said weakly. "I thought you were just lost." I looked up. And did humiliating me help? Her eyes filled with tears. No. Did laughing while others mocked me feel like protection? She shook her head. "I didn't think," she whispered. "That's the problem," I replied gently. "You didn't." Rachel stared down at the table. "I was ashamed," she admitted. "Not of you, of what I thought you were doing." The honesty hurt more than the speeches ever had. "You believed ambition had an age limit," I said. "And once I crossed it, you decided I was embarrassing." She nodded slowly. "I didn't mean to be cruel," she said. "But you were," I replied. We sat in silence again. Finally, she asked the question that mattered. "What do we do now?" I met her gaze. "We start by acknowledging that success doesn't excuse disrespect," I said. "And motherhood doesn't require endurance of humiliation." She swallowed. "I want to fix this." "I know," I said. "But fixing it will take time." Rachel agreed to counseling, something she'd once mocked me for suggesting years earlier. We started family therapy not to heal the wedding, but to understand the assumptions that led to it. It wasn't easy. There were sessions where she cried, others where she grew defensive, and a few where she said nothing at all. But progress came slowly. Meanwhile, the rest of the world adjusted quickly. Jake stopped calling me Mom and started calling me Ms. Thompson. He asked for advice. Carefully. Respectfully. Funny how tone changes when power becomes visible. My sister, once dismissive, now bragged about me to her friends. Former critics became admirers. People who had laughed now asked for introductions, meetings, favors. I granted none of them easily. Because respect that arrives late must prove itself. But the most important shift wasn't external. It was internal. For the first time in my life, I stopped explaining myself. I stopped softening my accomplishments. Stopped minimizing my success. Stopped shrinking to fit expectations. Rachel noticed. "You're different," she said during one session. "Yes," I replied. I finally stopped asking permission. She nodded slowly, as if understanding something too late, but genuinely. And though our relationship wasn't healed, it was honest. Which was something it had never been before. The wedding ended, but the damage didn't, and what happened afterward forced my daughter to confront the truth she'd been avoiding for years. Power doesn't announce itself the way people expect. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. And it doesn't need revenge. Power shows up quietly, when you stop accepting what once felt normal. A few months after the wedding, Rachel invited Jake and me to dinner. It wasn't a celebration. No grand gesture. Just an attempt at normalcy. But nothing about us was normal anymore. Jake arrived tense, overly polite. He sat straighter than usual, spoke carefully, and laughed at moments that didn't require laughter. Respect had replaced familiarity, and not in a healthy way. Rachel noticed it too. "Please stop acting like she's your boss," she snapped at him halfway through dinner. Jake froze. I set my fork down. "I am not his boss," I said calmly. "But I also won't pretend power doesn't exist just to make others comfortable." Rachel exhaled sharply. "That's exactly what I mean." "No," I replied. "It's exactly what you avoided for years." The table went quiet. "You were comfortable when I was invisible," I continued. "When my success was hypothetical. When my ambition felt harmless." Rachel looked away. "But now that it's real," I said, "you want me to minimize it again so things feel familiar." She swallowed. "I just want my mom back." I softened, but not fully. "You never lost me," I said. "You just didn't want to see who I was becoming." That was the moment I drew the line. "I love you," I told her. "But I won't tolerate being disrespected by jokes, by assumptions, or by silence." She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. "I don't want to be embarrassed by you anymore," she whispered. I shook my head gently. "You weren't embarrassed by me," I said. "You were embarrassed by the idea that I didn't fit the story you told yourself." That night, something finally shifted. Rachel stopped apologizing out of guilt and started listening out of understanding. She asked real questions, not about money, but about why I built what I built. "I was scared," she admitted later. "If you could start over at 60, what excuse did that leave me?" And there it was. My success hadn't threatened her socially. It had threatened her comfort. From that point on, things changed, not dramatically, but honestly. Rachel stopped introducing me as just retired. She stopped correcting people when they assumed things about me. And for the first time, she defended me when others dismissed ambition with age. But the biggest change happened inside me. I stopped shrinking. I stopped cushioning truths. Stopped translating my success into something easier to swallow. Stopped apologizing for existing beyond expectation. At 62, I learned the most valuable lesson of my life. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate. And I had tolerated too much for too long. That wedding didn't break our family. It exposed it. And exposure, while painful, is sometimes the only path to rebuilding something stronger. Still, there was one final moment, quiet, unexpected, that brought everything full circle. It didn't happen in a boardroom. It didn't involve money. It happened when Rachel finally said something she had never said before. And just when I thought the story was over, my daughter said something so honest, it finally revealed why my success had frightened her all along. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. No spotlight. No audience. No applause. Rachel and I were sitting on my balcony, watching the city settle into evening. The air was calm, the kind of quiet that only exists when nothing is being avoided anymore. She had been unusually thoughtful all day. Finally, she broke the silence. "I was wrong," she said. "Not rushed. Not defensive. Not wrapped in excuses. Just honest. I didn't just underestimate you," she continued. I reduced you. I didn't respond right away. When people laughed at you, she said, her voice shaking, I laughed too. Not because it was funny, but because I was afraid of standing alone. That admission mattered more than any apology. I thought aging meant retreat, she said. I thought ambition had an expiration date. And when you refused to slow down, I convinced myself you were lost. She looked at me then, really looked at me. You weren't lost, she whispered. You were becoming. Tears welled in her eyes. And I tried to shrink you because your growth scared me. I reached for her hand. That fear, I said gently, is something many people never admit. She nodded. I see that now. That moment didn't erase everything. But it healed enough. Months later, life settled into a new rhythm. Rachel stopped introducing me as her retired mother. She introduced me as Diana Thompson. Jake learned humility the hard way, but to his credit, he grew. He listened more. Assumed less. And when he spoke, it was no longer from superiority but curiosity. As for me, I didn't change my lifestyle. Still drove the same car. Still lived simply. Still worked quietly. But internally, everything was different. I no longer explained myself to be accepted. I no longer softened my edges to be liked. I no longer feared being misunderstood. The wedding had given me something unexpected. Clarity. It taught me that being underestimated is not an insult, it's an opportunity. That people's discomfort often says more about their limits than yours. And that the most dangerous thing you can do at any age is decide to stop growing. 6 months later, I stood in a conference room surrounded by executives half my age. They listened carefully, took notes, asked questions. Not because I demanded respect, but because I earned it. And when someone asked me how it felt to reinvent myself later in life, I smiled. I didn't reinvent myself, I said. I finally allowed myself to expand. That's the truth. Aging didn't diminish me. Silence did. And once I stopped being silent, everything changed. So if there's one lesson my daughter's wedding taught me, it's this. Never let someone else's comfort determine your potential. Never let age decide when your story ends. And never underestimate the power of a woman who's done being underestimated. Because sometimes, the moment they laugh at you is the moment you've already won. Because sometimes the moment they laugh at you is the exact moment you've already outgrown them.